Hi, and welcome to Unplanned, the show about cities and how they work. I'm Sam, your host, and remember to hit the subscribe button for plenty more interesting conversations to come. But today we get to talk to somebody who's on a topic that I find just absolutely fascinating, both because he's fascinating, but also the topic itself is fascinating. And that's the intersection of cities and film. And to help us understand that and to walk us into that is Ezra Glenn, who teaches at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. And Ezra, I want to just welcome you to Unplanned.
Thanks, Sam. Thanks. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been watching for a while, and so it's exciting to suddenly be in here and see how the magic is made.
Well, I'm thrilled you're on Unplanned. I know you write about planning issues yourself, which is always interesting to read and hear what you're up to. But let's get into the topic we're talking about today, which is cities and film. And why don't we start with you're teaching at MIT a class on cities and film. I don't know what you've actually called the class, but tell us a little bit about that. What's that all about?
Sure, you're actually very close to it. The title is The City in Film. Very nice, simple, descriptive title. The basic idea. So you and I met years ago when I was working as a planner. I worked in Somerville City Hall, which this is the city I grew up in, and I've worked as a planner. But about 14 years ago, I left municipal employment and went to MIT. Over the past 14 years, I have found I have drifted more and more from urban planning to urban studies. I find that the longer I'm there, I'm sort of enjoying this space to slow down a bit, stop rushing to change cities, and be a little more reflective and try to spend some time thinking about what cities are in the first place. And one thing that I hit upon to sort of slow me down and turn my eyes towards cities was film. You go see a movie, it's this wonderful thing where you have to sit down in the dark, be quiet for a couple hours and watch something, pay attention.
You got a bunch of students. First of all, are they undergraduates? Are they graduate students? Who are these students?
And they're undergrads, and what we do is we use film as a kind of bait to get them. Undergrads love film. I mean, everybody loves to see films and talk about them. You make them read a book and ask them to talk about it, and they freeze up. But everybody, when they see a film, has an opinion and they want to talk about it. And so film is a great way to kind of draw them out and get them to think about a material. So I've put together a syllabus. It's about 13. We have 13 weeks. We have 13 films over about 100 years of city history and film history.
What is the intersection between these two? Are you trying to understand cities as they've been represented over the last 100, or is it also the development of film over it? I mean, how films have changed. Where are you coming at it from?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's sort of, I'd say, I try to encourage this right off the bat. I let them know it's not a film studies course. I teach that over, a different department. But there are two important things. One is seeing what the films show us about cities over time, and also what they show us about attitudes about cities. Because when someone tells you a story, they're telling you two things. They're telling you what happened, and they're telling you what they think is important about what happened. So that's sort of an exciting thing about looking at films, as you can see. When somebody sits down to make a film about a city, what did they think they needed to capture, and also what did they ignore? Which parts, whose stories did they not tell? And so we try to pull out some meaning there. So, for example, let me jump into the first one. Does that sound good?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, give us the overview of the 13 films. What are some examples? And maybe we can speak specifically about a couple of these, or two or three of them.
Sure. It changes a little bit from year to year, just because I get bored of doing the same ones.
Sure.
And as I tell the students, there's this challenge that we're covering about 120 years of urban history and film history. So you could imagine every week we need to go through a decade, right? It's a pretty big world, right? There's Europe, there's America, there's places that aren't Europe and America. And we might want to think about those cities and films, right? So now we have 120 years of history and a whole bunch of different regions. And then we also have all kinds of different topics we want to study. films about crime, films about architecture, films about transportation, films about jobs and economics, right? So that's three different dimensions. And there's a fourth, there's different genres of film, right? There's science fiction films, there's horror films, there's romance, there's musical. So ideally, if you taught this course, you would every decade have one of each genre from every different country on each different topic. But that would take years and years and years. So you pick and choose. And it's very important to try to get them to understand we may suddenly turn to musicals in 1959 and look at West Side Story, but that doesn't mean the musical was invented in 1959.
You say 120 years of film, which is about the history of the moving film, basically the movie. But what about a film that depicts a city from the 18th century or the 12th century? Is that fair game, or is that not part of the syllabus?
It should be fair game, but my experience is students have a really hard time understanding that a movie did not take place when it was made.
Interesting.
That with one exception, they get it that science fiction was not made in the future, right? So if you see Blade Runner, you understand that's 1980s view of the future, and they can kind of get that. But even something like Chinatown is a classic one. Everyone says, "Oh, do you show Chinatown in class?" Right? Have you seen Chinatown?
Me, yes. So yes, a favorite. He was as a young man an absolute favorite of mine. I haven't seen it in years.
You remember when it's set?
I'm gonna say it's in the 20s, but I'm not certain about that. 30s,
yeah,
maybe.
30s. But yeah, do you remember when it's made?
It's in the 70s. I think it's mid 70s, as I recall it.
But so a lot of the undergrads now, to us, we get it because the 70s is something we remember. So we get it. This was made in the 70s and it's kind of retro. But to the students, I think the 70s seems old already.
All right. So before we get into some specific ones, why don't you just give us a sense of, you've got your 13 weeks, you've mentioned science fiction, you mentioned musicals. What are some examples just sort of span those 13 weeks? And then maybe we could dive into a couple of these films that you're talking about.
Sure. The classic go-to that everybody assumes is the kind of crime noir type. I mean, people think of cities, they think of them gray and gritty and dangerous. At least people of our generation. And it's interesting to see that changing. So we're sort of, the dangers, you'll be overrepresented in those categories. Things like Mean Streets, right? Taxi Driver. I try to stay away from them because they already know them, right? They already get that. So instead, I cover some experimental type films, like the first one, which is wonderful. It's not exactly a documentary, but it's a nonfiction film called Berlin Symphony of a City. And it's sort of this very artistic, it's what's called a city symphony, actually. It was an early genre that doesn't exist so much. So we have that. We have musicals like West Side Story or sometimes On the Town. There's science fiction like Blade Runner or Metropolis, a very classic early science fiction. As we get into the 80s and 90s, we get much more into dealing with race in the city. So we see Do the Right Thing. We've seen Blind Spotting or Crash. These are all films dealing with kind of racial dynamics in the city.
All right. So you said you were going to take us into a couple of these movies.
One thing I love is this, slowing down, digging in. I mean, you really could do a podcast on any one of these films, or on any one scene in any one of them. That's really what's fun, is the leaning in, the slowing down. And it's great to watch the students do that and realize how much they can extract. So, for example, let's the Berlin Symphony of a Great City is the one I want to start with.
Sure.
So this is from 1927.
Yeah.
So that's silent, black and white. This is really the first decade or so of kind of full feature-length films. And what's exciting, I think, is many people assume, film must have started pretty boring and then taken a while and then got experimental later. But it turns out the early decades are when it's most experimental, because they haven't figured out what the heck a film is.
How does it, so there's this, it's called Berlin, a City Symphony. Maybe I got that wrong. What about cities? What about the film? What's it all about? What does it get into?
So what it basically shows, it's by a guy named Walter Ruttman, who was he wasn't a documentary filmmaker. He wasn't a narrative filmmaker. He was a sort of experimental artist. His other stuff is actually weird. It's like almost animation, sort of pictures of light and drawings on animated film. But he decided he wanted to make a film that would capture the spirit of Berlin. And this is Berlin, 1927. Between the wars, it's the Weimar Republic. It was considered by many to be the most vibrant, most modern city in Europe. And he really wanted to capture the entire feeling of the energy of Berlin. So what he did is he sent film crews out throughout the entire city. They recorded stuff over an entire year and then edited it down, took the year and made it into a pretend day. And it does this sort of classic thing you'll see in a million films where it begins with the sun coming up and the city's kind of quiet and asleep. There's maybe somebody sweeping or a cat looking through a window. And then gradually the city wakes up. And over the course of 5 acts, like a symphony, we see the city wake up, eat its breakfast, go to work, transportation, the factories get going, then there's a break for lunch, then back to work, newspapers are being delivered, the whole city's in motion, everything's happening. And then, you get into the evening and the entertainment and the partying, and you basically spend about 2 hours experiencing life in Berlin. So that's why one of the reasons it's so great for the students is to see this city in motion. See how
But
much
let's before we get into sort of reflecting on the movies, let's get a couple more movies in the bucket, and then we'll sort of talk about all of them. What's your next movie? So that's Berlin 1927. What's the next movie you wanted to pick out?
Sure. I mean, so then we go through a number between there and say after the war. I guess the next one I wanted to talk about was moving from Berlin to New York City in 1948, when we get The Naked City, which is this classic. Many people call it a film noir, but it is. Those who love film noir will say this isn't really film noir. This is pretending to be film noir. It's trying to
Why?
capture the style.
What is it about that? Tell us about that.
Well, the film is basically it begins with a murder. Some late at night, you're in an apartment, there's a woman, there's somebody who seems to want something, and a scream and a closed door, and she's murdered, right? Then the police arrive on the scene, and you suddenly realize you are watching the very first police procedural. This is like every episode of Law and Order or Dragnet or 100.
And give us a definition of a police procedural. It's like all these, but what does that mean? What does that mean for a movie watcher, moviegoer?
It's funny because when you hear what it is, you think that would be the most boring thing in the world. Procedural doesn't sound that interesting, right? But it's basically a movie or a television show that takes you through the process of solving a mystery and tracking down the murderer and catching them and bringing them to justice, right?
Right. Got it.
What's interesting is the bureaucratic professional process by which the criminal is captured. And that's why it's such a perfect movie for 1948. You're just about to head into the age of conformity and the organization man and professionalism and gray suits and that's kind of the escalation of the bureaucracy as the hero of the story.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And the other thing about The Naked City, which I have seen that movie. Well, I saw the Berlin movie courtesy of you. And I was fascinated by it, blown away by it. But in The Naked City, New York itself is almost a character in the film. There's a lot of active live street shots of the city in action. And that's one of the things that I took away from it. Most wonderful scenes of sort of historic. It's also a historic record of the city at that time, at that moment, like you're saying, I suppose.
Yeah, it's shot on location in I think about 100 different places throughout New York City, and that was pretty exciting. In 1948, it was really like New York City and America was finally sort of getting its spotlight. Here it is. We just won the war for the whole world. We made, this is going to be the future. This is the American century now. So I did have a third one that I thought fit well with the theme.
Yeah.
So just to give you a sense of what that theme is with Berlin, I said, we're seeing the whole city. He's recorded everything and digested it down for this one day. With the Naked City, you get the same thing because the way the cops have to solve this crime, they have to go through the entire city from high to low, top of the skyscrapers, down underground, Yonkers, down to the Bay, the immigrants, the Brahmins, everybody. So you get, again, this full picture of the city. And then the third one I wanted to just mention, it's a kind of a quirky, it's actually a documentary, came out a couple years ago. I like it because it's not in America, and it's going to a city a little bit like you were saying, a very old city. This is a movie set in Istanbul. It's called Kedi, which is how you say
Don't know it.
kitty in Turkish, I guess. It's a documentary that follows around a bunch of street cats in Istanbul and gets right down into the level of the cats. Istanbul is a place that I guess for centuries has had free range cats who just sort of run through the city. They'll go to the deli and get fed, and then they'll sleep in an awning somewhere, and then chase a mouse in the sewer. And the film reminds you that we think of all the action happening up here at human level, but there's a whole nother ecosystem of the city, and it's very fun to think of how different the experience must be. And I sort of like that, to sort of open your eyes up to think cities are wonderful because they are full of very diverse experiences. The city you live in is very different from the city even your neighbor lives in, right?
Absolutely
So
fascinating.
that's the
Now,
sort of three I was thinking.
yeah, no, and you've given us three. If you were, let's picture you have a room full of students and you're sort of wrapping up. You've seen these three movies. You've described these three things. What have you walked us through? What should we take away? Assume we're your students. What would you share with us about these three different movies that presumably tell us something about a city, what a city is, the history of the moment the film was made? What is it we should take away from it?
I would really encourage them to notice an interesting sort of paradox. So the Naked City, I don't know if you remember the TV show that was based on the movie.
I know that it existed. I never saw the show, but I know it was there.
So the tagline of the film and then the TV show was, I think it was, there are 8 million stories in the Naked City. This has been one of them.
Right.
And so you had this sort of sense, and that it was great for the TV show because it meant tune in next week and we'll go through a whole nother story here in the Naked City.
Right.
So that's the first thing, is to just realize this point of how many stories are unfolding every day in a city.
Right. Right.
What's interesting about that is realizing on the one hand, they are all connected, but on the other hand, they are all distinct. And you may have to stop and think, what was happening when I was over here? What was happening over there? With each of them, you do realize these decisions they made. So for example, with the first film, with Berlin, and this is an interesting point that the students don't always catch, but then when it's pointed out, everyone notices it. Everybody realizes, oh my gosh, how did I not notice that? You watch this 2-hour movie, you see a full day all across Berlin, all kinds of things happening. Rich people, poor people, fat people, skinny people. You see the zoo, you see the kids, you see the factories, you see it all. And then only in class later does somebody finally note, hey, we never saw inside anybody's house. Everything in that film was in the public sphere. And that's a choice that Ruttman made. When he wanted to capture what a city was, he very much thought about the public space. The city is a stage that we all play our dramas out, and we're always on view. And that's probably because he's a filmmaker who likes to watch and tell. But he even plays with it. There's sort of the wonderful moments where you see like shutters opening on the houses and you can see an arm coming out, but you never go inside that house.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, let me ask you about, as we get towards the end of this episode of Unplanned, you mentioned to me as we were talking about doing this, a movie about Boston City Hall. And I think for people local here in the Boston metro area, they might find that one particularly interesting.
Yeah, so this is a great movie. It just came out. I think it was released just in December so that it could, be listed for the Oscars this year. And it's been it's either nominated or shortlisted. It's on everyone's list for best documentary. This is a movie called City Hall. It's by the documentary filmmaker Fred Wiseman, who's actually local. Fred Wiseman is famous for making very extensive, comprehensive documentaries. They are often 3, 4, 5 hours long. They're difficult to sit through until you flick a switch in your mind and you sort of say, I just want to observe. I want to see what's going on. So he did essentially like Walter Ruttman. He camped out in Boston City Hall and related environments for, I think, well over a year. What is amazing is how natural it comes off as. He somehow has a way of embedding himself in these environments and allowing the people to just become people again, doing what they do. And what's nice about Wiseman is I think he has confidence that normal people doing normal jobs is fascinating. We tend to think that film and television and even reading is a kind of passive thing, right? The author or the filmmaker did all the work and I'm just digesting. But digesting is hard work. And so if you're willing to sort of say, okay, this person curated this bunch of information and I want to think about it as it flows over my brain, then it's fascinating.
Wonderful stuff. Any last thoughts as we close out this segment of Unplanned and Films? It's certainly my hope that we can come back to the subject. There's so many movies out there, and there's so many interesting things to think about movies and just to share with people. But as we close out this section, what any last thoughts for us?
No, I would say the only other thought I would give, you made this point just a minute ago about that there's sort of almost in The Naked City, you can almost think of New York as a character in itself. And I think that's really true with many films. Often you need to go watch them a second time. The first time you're going to watch it, you're trying to make sense. You're trying to keep the two detectives separate. You're trying to follow the plot. That's great. Get that all down and then watch it again and pay attention to the settings, to the movement through space. And you'll really appreciate there's a whole world. The filmmakers created this whole space for you.
Well, Ezra Glenn,
spend a lot of time on.
Somebody who thinks a lot about movies, teaches, helps students understand them, get into the world of both film and cities. A real pleasure having you on Unplanned. Let's get you back on at some point. We'll talk about some more movies.
That sounds good. We'll never do them all. So there's always another one.